The Conduit, Part 3, Journey. The body writhed upon the bedroom floor, knocking all assembled items about by the action of limbs, alternating maniacally between flexed and limpness as the voltaic messengers made their repeated journey, traveling from the cortex down through the spinal cord and branching out into the peripheral musculature to command the untimely firing of the undesired contractions. The surmounting of the consecutive electrical gates continued for a significant duration, launching the form into a series of nearly ballistic motions, which caused a slow skidding across the carpet to the extent of minor rug burns, despite the fact that most of the involuntary movement was contained to vertical and minutely lateral directions, between the cyclical arching and slackening of the back and the flailing of the extremities. The atavistic source continued its whispers throughout, but the seizing had seized control over the creature with such force that comprehension was rendered impossible. At last, the energies died down along with the transmission, and the wretch collapsed into a sweaty and somewhat tremorous heap of electrochemistry. When at last my default mode of consciousness had regained continuity, it seemed as though the episode had brought about clarity in a number of ways, not by the effects of my own extensive mental labors, but largely by forces of comprehension essentially imparted upon the repository, some conglomerate vestige of insight passed down in a notion of primordial inheritance. The night had passed, and daybreak in turn, by this interval of wakefulness. Outside, a glimpse of the blinding rays which empower the daywalker could be observed, pervading through the shroud of the single window's thick curtains. However active or passive it is to be in action, there is great certainty in the benefits of stride to the process of processing, to contemplate and organize information in depth, that is. In accordance with this directive, I sprang to my feet, tumbling forward with the assembled force of accumulated muscles underutilized, and set in motion from a single bound. The appendages scrambled from the house, taking flight while thoughts did, as if lifting off mechanically into the lofty process of reconsolidation, to properly and cohesively assimilate the recent events with the differential narrative of existence which had preceded them. The unconsciousness, situated simply below the bounds of utterance, yet entirely in play within all mechanisms of composition, functionally in parallel with acts of awareness, yet carried out by a series of sequential transductions spanning unknown depth and duration. Glyphs upon glyphs of unknown quality, layers upon layers of unvocalized language, which stood to constitute the skeletal function of one's own mind, culminating ultimately at what might be the most basal level of informational processing, the abhorrent amalgams of sinew, which once transduced within the plane of inner vision, present themselves as the atavistic scourge which once belonged to the primordial dawn. I will name it. This describes the archetypical unconsciousness. It was not beyond conception that the aforementioned had been revealed to me as a matter of course, spawning, of course, from my own integral avarice, that which in turn had been imparted by the manner of the circumstantial cascade which spanned the duration of my existence upon the sphere, in addition to all events previous, as the deterministic dominoes toppled into one another to evoke the cosmic equation from the beginning of time. Indeed, it must be divulged that the nature of my own avarice was of lust for greater action pertaining to the conduit, that yearning which had prompted me to seek in my youth the mechanistic study of the object, and which had ultimately situated the being into undertaking the present quest towards greater depths of cognitive inquisition. Entwined with this realization, however, there was another portentous implication which could not be suppressed from cognizance. Relatively little is claimed to be known regarding the circumstances of early hominid evolution, and even then, all which can be proposed exists in a state of inference, testimonies of bone shards, carbon dating, gases frozen in ice. A grand speculation based upon the corpses of far antiquity, mere conjecture which provides little description of the cognitive life of our primogenitors. As the unholy caricatures of the archetypes flash through the mind, one could not help but consider the nature of these primordial forces unbeknownst to the modern man, which etched with such force these horrors into the pattern-processing function of the incipients, creatures who could speak no language but dedicated immense resources to the detection of information structures lurking within the environment associated with those nightmarish neuronal assemblies. How could the flimsy deductions of the contemporaries stand up to the felt impression of the primordial terror, which one is honed not to ignore, that which had been painstakingly chiseled into, at the risk of survival, one's progenitors, and selected for, by a mind which casts off all excess, to be retained until the present day? The ramifications chilled me to the very core. There is only one known method by which man can, in earnest and in whole, extricate oneself from the intricately interwoven tethers of circumstance. Galvanized in body and mind alike by the revelations of late, I was in no position to go about that act, and instead determined to entertain the idiosyncratic fixation instilled within me by means of going further upon the path set about. Abandonment of the urge to extricate the obsession, located at the very core of one's assembled narrative of being, results in turn by the manifestation of an all-encompassing desire to enact that form of volition to its satisfactory fulfillment, as judged by the cognition, and with little regard for the arduous tasks which will be set upon the form throughout this hypnotic pursuit. I must continue on, the monologue cried, as my rapid footfalls continued upon the less metaphorical pathway. Continue on this descent, until this juncture into the chasm of the unconsciousness reveals its true nature and mechanism by the entirety. My feet raced upon the greenbelt pathway, taking great strides as the mind was fully enraptured in the exhalation of further inquiry. It had to take place with the utmost haste, this sequential expedition into the unconsciousness, for fear of losing the ley line into the mind's atavistic depths, as the material components which evoke the phenomenon were always prone to shifting as a result of natural development, the culling and overriding of previous information and connections, regardless of the direction pertaining to desires of the conscious mind. After hurtling over the minute spires of the cobblestones once again, I rushed within the confines of the domicile, and continued into what had become the ritual room, hard set on the objective. Once the implements of recall were organized in place, it began again. Barring the inhibition which attempted to instill itself by the residual instincts of the nervous system, I navigated to the last leyline location of the Ancient's transmission within that cavern, filled not with fear, but with resolve to do what must be done, to pay the price in whatever was required for admittance through that gate of knowledge. Cripple me, shatter my form, rend me apart, for the truth must be known upon this momentous night. I tuned the point of mental focus once again upon the primal flow of abstract conceptions. The construct of the forebears responded in kind. There existed no urge to look away now, to fail to brave the reprehensible underpinnings, as the veracity for subliminal insight overcame any temporary pangs of visceral disgust experienced at the vile prospects regarding the potential environmental factors which surrounded the origination of hominid faculties. The awareness found itself ushered in to a new state of being hitherto unexplored by the waking mind, but always known to it in some silent way. The present manifestation of this realm, however, did not stay silent for long. The tranquil, surreal, ethereal transfer of the mind into a new state of introcognitive experience crescendoed into a deafening torment of the thought senses. The waking mind was not suited to process the squall of unconscious signaling which surged upon it, and the richness in the minutiae of information being transferred was simply so overwhelming in total quantity as to evoke mental pain as the subjective experience, so much pain, as it was conjured by an excess of the mind itself, rather than an injury extraneous to the central circuitry. It was an untethered agony which surpassed all feeling ever felt in the body, despite the myriad damages which had occurred to it throughout a life lived in battered earnest. And the waves of pain threatened to overwhelm the consciousness of its functioning. This did not come to pass, however, as ultimately the processing adjustments had been made in time by the shadow engineers of cortical development, and the awareness found that the force of the inner sensory influx to have been dampened to a tolerable level, attenuated away by some mechanism of translation. In place of what was previously only excruciating, there now existed an experience akin to being born anew, a flood of urges befitting only a nascent entity, that of unrestrained voracious immaturity, to consume and synthesize by the senses all that was present and accessible in the surroundings, to the end of the generation of an understanding. It was not without effort to learn this novel way of processing the vestigial undercurrents of cognitive design, but it did come intuitively, as of course the present systems being interacted with were intimately coupled with those responsible for the modulation and generation of the awareness which in turn traversed this place. Perhaps one of the most striking differences between this underrealm and that of typical awareness was that there was no sense of time, or at least there was a lack of fixed temporal position, which accelerates through circumstance to the end of proper sorting. Instead, the churning information matrix simply was, with all the bits moving to their proper places. In absence of the activation of modules which dictated extraneous inputs to the conscious system, it appeared to be an interior symphony of self-serving machinations rather than a construct designed for reactivity. It was immensely satisfying to bear witness to this enactment of the subcomponents of emergent selfhood, but this level alone did not represent the totality of the unconscious space. At what could only be perceived to be the basal level, further within the bits of information ferried about by the machinery of the unconscious assembly. That was where, once again, those entities which I had come to recognize as the archetypes resided. Each transference of the sort was so rich in itself that it was no wonder that the initial contact with this realm had been overwhelming to the extent of cognitive agony. It was as if each of the instances of transmission contained an entire world of patterns situated atop one another, the archetypes individually signaling the proportionate presence of an interior concept indicated within the message at large. Not all of the manifestations were as horrible in vision to the mind's eye as had been initially proposed. In fact, they seemed to span the entire spectrum of subjective experience, which stood to reason, as these ancient patterns likely constituted the basis of it, akin to the amino acids of the body, whereas the mind assembled these interior signalings into its concepts. Those concepts in turn combined to assemble the grand conceptual matrix, which the mind called upon to denote representations of extraneous stimuli and other information by way of relativity, referentially encoded using the patterned communications privy only within the unconsciousness. It became clear, with what seemed to be extended observation, as the temporal anomaly inherent to the space denied any proper estimates of subjective duration, that one of the fundamental qualities of the archetypes, and that which was felt so viscerally upon recollection, was the nature of how each individual pattern represented, in abstraction, a precise signaling of prospective survival outcome. This deep, primitive connection between the basal circuitry and internal calculations of the primate's likelihood of continued health was the most viable explanation for the intensity of feeling upon bearing witness to those abhorrent amalgams. If anything, the question which remained, in retrospect, was in determining what sort of extraneous inputs could posit the origination of such terrifying constructs, as in function the mind could most typically be relied upon to generate imagery from existing compounds of stimuli. As mentioned previously, due to the factors at play, the duration elapsed, if any, could not be estimated, and so I say, after a time, it became time to take leave of that realm and return to that of wakefulness. When the trance of introspection had once again been dispersed, bringing the awareness back into corporeal manipulation of the primate, in addition to the temporal attenuation of hazards, it came at great surprise that a vestige of the delving experience had been imparted to the waking mind. There was, in nearly full privy to the consciousness, a subset of calculations now overlaid upon the previous visual perception of the material reality in all places. Anywhere which one might direct the attention, it could be found now that a greater depth of information existed to be grasped at. Shockingly coherent information, which in some inexplicable way could not entirely be vocalized or otherwise transmuted, seemed to fit into place with exactitude, relative to the thoughts, mental constructions, sounds, or visual imagery which the novel information was superimposed upon. While the new interface of awareness was quite overwhelming to navigate within waking life in the beginning, it soon became apparent that there existed a degree of conscious control over how much of the ostensible unconscious calculation was allowed in for the majority of intervals. At times, it became exceedingly pervasive and generally incorrigible as a function of distraction amidst situations requiring precise and focused conscious acuity. But this was ultimately acceptable as a trade-off in the sense that there remained the likelihood of learning to restrain it further by intention in the future, and in what an immense boon this insight otherwise provided into the subtle workings of things. To describe the phenomenon as a whole in the simplest terms, this change in awareness represented a shift of the divide between conscious and unconscious mental actions, to where more of the unconscious machinery was now in purview of the active mind. The form of the agency afforded by this modification manifested most clearly in the degree of control over thought actions, constructive perceptions, general discernment, and calculations now possible, as the mind demonstrated itself with full force of acuity at all times, if allowed, metaphorically akin to operating the simian on manual, whence it was once run on automatic. Surely any competent operator of the automobile can immediately comprehend the advantages of such a setup. The existence continued on, as it often does, largely free of incident, barring minor occurrences. Often it would be inquired about, the source of inexplicable insights into a person's character, or perhaps the similarities between individuals, and I would be left entirely unable to divulge a suitable response in earnest. Additionally, I frequently found myself with the answers to various neurological phenomena of significance in hand, forced to research to the end of confabulating the process which led to these discoveries. This led to little success in publication, for I could not, in good conscience, submit any papers not properly substantiated by rigorous and documented experimentation. The patterns manifested, when allowed, into the routine experiences pertaining to the business of living, and in conducting this business, the holding of such rare interior insight was of an intrinsic value which outweighed any sum of resources which the extraneous world might offer in return for demonstration of these abilities. Perhaps, most curious of all, was to find that the sense of intuitive danger which had manifested throughout since childhood, in what had seemed previously to be an odd and superstitious act, was now substantiated by the appearance of subtle traces of the abhorrent ones, which can now be detected in the environment, at times of the sort when pathways were to be taken back and bridges not to be crossed. This concludes today's recording of The Conduit. Thank you for your time.